now, investigators of Valley Homes searched in connection to the Tupac Shakur murder investigation nearly 27 years after his death.
Police with taser, make yourself known. Yeah, it's in the loft as well. Yep.
Nearly 3 decades after the death of Tupac Shakur, investigators uncovered disturbing evidence inside his private studio that left even seasoned cops shaken. What the cops found was a trail of chilling plans, hidden thoughts, and unsettling clues that suggested Tupac's final months were far more complicated than anyone ever realized. The shocking discovery exposed a dark, emotional transformation that completely changes how people understand the final chapter of one of hip-hop's most influential figures.
This is the indictment we've been waiting almost 3 decades for. It spells out the facts and circumstances and what justifies a Clark County grand jury in returning an indictment. Justice will be served.
Nearly 27 years after the death of Tupac Shakur, investigators were still sorting through the fragments he left behind. Everything moved quickly, almost methodically, as if the business side of Tupac's life had to be resolved before the emotional side even had time to settle. But one room didn't move with the rest. It stayed sealed for months, caught between legal claims and quiet disagreements about who actually had authority over what was inside. And when clearance was finally granted, investigators expected something predictable. But the moment the door opened, something felt off. The studio didn't feel abandoned, it felt preserved.
In the Tupac murder case, since this all happened, since the murder happened, they never served a search warrant and, showed up at someone's house with the SWAT team back in 1996. So this is definitely, it can't be overstated how big of a deal this is.
There were no gold records on the walls, no framed magazine covers, no visible reminders of fame. The absence of recognition was the first detail that stood out. Instead of decoration, the walls were lined with structured shelving units built for function, not appearance. Each container was labeled carefully, dates written in deliberate handwriting, as if whoever organized the room expected someone else to eventually read the system. The sound-treated walls created a strange silence inside the space. Not the comfortable quiet of a creative studio, but a deeper isolation, the kind of silence where decisions get made carefully, where thoughts are revised before they are ever spoken aloud. Investigators later described the atmosphere as controlled, almost calculated. Even the desk placement told its own story.
These new pictures that came out of the shooting scene where Tupac Shakur was murdered 27 years ago, I don't know why we haven't seen these, but they've been in a vault ever since September 7th, 1996, the night that he and Suge Knight were in that BMW and were fired upon by the white Cadillac next to them on the strip. Suddenly, we are seeing pictures we've never seen before.
It wasn't positioned toward the microphone booth the way most recording artists prefer. Instead, the main desk faced inward, toward stacks of documents and notebooks arranged in precise order. It didn't look like a space designed for performance. It looked like a space designed for planning. And then investigators opened the notebooks. They weren't filled with lyrics, at least not in the way anyone expected.
I like to think I'm revolutionary.
He's considered one of the most influential rappers of all time.
The pages didn't contain scattered rhyme schemes or unfinished verses scribbled between recording sessions. Instead, each notebook was structured with unusual discipline. Sections divided by topic, margins filled with organized revisions, entire passages written in careful sequence rather than bursts of inspiration. Some pages outlined long-form film concepts. Others contained cultural analysis broken into numbered points. Several entries referenced historical figures and leadership structures, drawing connections between influence, identity, and public responsibility. This wasn't random creativity. It was strategic thinking documented over time. One notebook contained detailed breakdowns of visual narratives exploring power systems and generational change. Another included essay-style reflections about how public figures can become trapped by expectations they never intended to carry forever. The tone felt serious, focused, intentional. Investigators began noticing repetition in the themes: control, ownership, transformation. Certain passages referenced the pressure of maintaining an image that had grown larger than the individual behind it. Others discussed the long-term consequences of allowing outside forces to define identity. Some notes even questioned whether creative freedom could exist without complete independence from industry influence. The deeper investigators looked, the clearer the pattern became. Tupac wasn't just creating content, he was documenting transition.
I'm trying to bring back 1989. I was poor in 1989, I was in jail, so now we out trying to show prosperity and hope in the future. This is why I could sit in jail for a year and not kill myself, so I could come out.
Multiple sections mapped out narrative structures for projects that extended far beyond music. Character outlines focused on internal conflict rather than external rivalry. Story arcs centered on evolution rather than confrontation. The consistency suggested these ideas weren't temporary experiments. They were part of a longer plan. What made the discovery feel unsettling was how deliberate everything appeared. Words replaced carefully rather than crossed out aggressively. Paragraphs reorganized with arrows guiding the sequence of thought. Several pages contained layered revisions, suggesting ideas were being refined repeatedly rather than written impulsively. Nothing inside the studio suggested chaos. Everything suggested preparation. And perhaps the most unusual detail was what investigators did not find. No trophies, no plaques, no visible reminders of past success. It was as if the person working inside that room had already detached from the version of himself the world recognized. The focus wasn't on preserving legacy, it was on building something new quietly, without announcement. Investigators would later note that the studio didn't feel like a place where fame was celebrated. It felt like a place where identity was being reconsidered. The public image associated with Tupac had always projected confidence, confrontation, unpredictability. But inside that room, the tone was controlled, measured, careful. The structure of the notebook suggested someone attempting to redirect the trajectory of their life without drawing attention to the shift while it was happening. And that's what made the discovery feel heavier than anyone expected. Because the deeper investigators looked, the clearer it became that whatever Tupac was preparing inside that studio, it wasn't meant for the spotlight. It was meant for what came after it.
There's no way of putting the brakes on, and he was trying, but if he stopped dead and walked away from being the gangster rapper, they'd get him anyway. Somebody who's out there is always trying to make a name for themselves.
And breaking in just the last hour, we are learning that Las Vegas police have searched a home in connection to the murder of Tupac.
Detectives thought they had already seen the most shocking parts of the studio. The binders, the timelines, the structured plans that didn't look anything like the chaotic lifestyle people always associated with Tupac Shakur. But then one officer noticed a small plastic crate tucked under the far side of the desk. Inside were dozens of DAT tapes, each one labeled in black marker with words that made investigators pause. Not for release. That alone was strange. Artists record unreleased music all the time, but these labels didn't look commercial. They looked personal, almost like warnings. When technicians finally played the first tape back at the station, the room reportedly went quiet. There was no beat, no hook, no attempt to sound radio ready. It was just Tupac talking. Calm, slow, careful. Not the aggressive delivery people expected. Not the fiery energy heard on tracks like those released under Death Row Records. This sounded like someone thinking out loud, documenting a transition nobody else even knew was happening. Several tapes focused on identity. Tupac described feeling trapped inside the image he created. He explained how the public expected intensity every time they saw him, even when he wanted to explore different creative directions. One line, repeated across multiple recordings, stood out to investigators. The idea of outgrowing the character before the character destroys the man. That wasn't album material. That sounded like someone realizing the role that made them famous might also be limiting their future. Sources familiar with the recording said the tone felt reflective, almost analytical. Tupac talked about pressure from the industry, pressure from fans, pressure from the expectations surrounding his association with Suge Knight. He didn't sound scared, but he sounded aware that evolution is complicated when millions of people expect you to stay the same. Some recordings included structured thoughts about long-term goals, including writing projects, film concepts, and educational initiatives focused on youth opportunity. It didn't sound like preparation for the next album cycle. It sounded like someone documenting a shift before announcing it publicly. Detectives noted that artists often leave behind unreleased songs, but this felt different. The tapes weren't about chart performance or marketing strategy. They sounded like checkpoints, evidence that Tupac was tracking his own mindset as it evolved, and the dates written on the tape suggested this reflection intensified during the summer of 1996, just weeks before the Las Vegas trip that would change everything.
And then we get to this, the same world that everybody else lives in except for is magnified like 10 times. So they just do all the things that normal people do, just 10 times harder.
Then investigators noticed something mounted on the wall across from the main workspace. At first glance, it looked like a basic planning board, but the closer they looked, the more unusual it became. It wasn't organized around album deadlines or tour dates. It was a timeline stretching months into the future past September 1996. That detail alone caught attention, because many people assumed Tupac's focus during that period was purely music output tied to Death Row's aggressive release schedule. Color-coded notes covered the board, each one referencing meetings that had nothing to do with recording sessions, film pitch discussions, publishing meetings, travel plans outside the United States. Some notes referenced international contacts and creative partnerships far outside traditional hip-hop networks. Detectives described the layout as structured, methodical, almost corporate, the type of strategic planning more commonly seen in startup offices than music studios.
Think you kinda fly. The best part was kissing Janet Jackson.
Mom ain't have to work. She's seen more money in her life than she ever had.
It gives me a certain amount of freedom in my music and just in general as a young black male to have, the opportunity to do movies where I can get money and, get in a certain spot in white Hollywood.
Several entries referenced discussions about ownership structures, creative control, and long-term positioning. Instead of focusing on performance revenue, the notes emphasized intellectual property, distribution leverage, and building systems that would continue operating even if the artist stepped away from the spotlight. That shift in focus surprised investigators who initially expected to find evidence of another album rollout. Instead, they found signs of someone preparing to rebalance their entire career model. What really unsettled the investigators was where the timeline stopped. The final set of notes ended only weeks after the Las Vegas trip in September 1996. No updates, no revisions, just an abrupt halt in planning that made the board feel unfinished, almost like a story cut off mid-sentence. Inside another folder, detectives discovered branding concepts that didn't mention Death Row at all, early-stage logo sketches, draft partnership outlines, preliminary legal phrasing referencing ownership of master recordings. Language about creative independence appeared repeatedly across multiple documents. Investigators reviewing the material later noted that many artists eventually seek ownership control, but these documents suggested Tupac was actively mapping that transition while still publicly aligned with his existing label structure. Some notes referenced mentorship programs for younger artists, with emphasis on giving them more control over their work than previous industry models allowed. Instead of traditional hierarchies where executives held power, the framework described collaborative development structures designed to build long-term sustainability for creators. That approach indicated Tupac was thinking beyond personal success. He appeared to be studying how creative ecosystems functioned and how they could be redesigned. The deeper investigators looked, the clearer the pattern became. The tapes documented internal change. The timeline mapped external change. The legal drafts prepared structural change. Each piece supported the same conclusion. Tupac wasn't just producing music during his final months. He was preparing for a transformation that would shift how he operated within the industry entirely. Detectives later noted that none of these materials contradicted the public persona people saw in interviews and performances, but they revealed a second layer operating quietly in parallel. While the public saw intensity, conflict, and controversy, the studio showed planning, reflection, and long-term positioning.
Somebody met me at the back and said, "Go help my buddy," and my buddy shot in the car. So
which ended up being Suge Knight. Whole car, was riddled with bullet holes.
The discovery of those tapes and documents didn't solve the case connected to Tupac's death, but it complicated the narrative surrounding his final months. Because instead of showing someone locked into one trajectory, the material suggested movement towards something different, something more controlled, more deliberate, more independent. Investigators already thought the studio couldn't surprise them anymore. They had seen the timelines, the private tapes, the legal drafts pointing toward independence from Death Row Records. But then they opened a long, flat storage case leaning against the far wall. Inside were large illustration boards, carefully stacked, each one protected by thin tracing paper. At first glance, they looked like comic panels, but the deeper detectives looked, the more they realized these weren't random sketches. These were film storyboards, and hardly anyone even knew they existed. Each panel outlined scenes focused on generational struggle, leadership pressure, and cultural responsibility. The main characters weren't written like typical action heroes. They were written like people trying to grow beyond the environments that shaped them. Instead of glorifying conflict, the notes emphasized transformation, growth, accountability. One storyboard described a young leader realizing influence comes with consequences that don't disappear once fame arrives. Investigators noticed the parallels almost immediately. The story arcs looked suspiciously similar to Tupac Shakur's life trajectory. What stood out most was the material's intention. These weren't entertainment-first plots chasing box office success. Notes in the margins referenced discussion topics for audiences, community screenings, and educational messaging tied to the film's themes. Tupac wasn't just telling stories, he appeared to be designing experiences that could shape how people thought about identity and responsibility. Detectives later said the material made it clear he saw storytelling as a tool, not just a product. Then came the personal writings, and this is where the atmosphere reportedly shifted again. Investigators found journal-style entries stored separately from the professional material. The handwriting felt more rushed, less structured, more personal. Several entries referenced exhaustion from constantly maintaining a public persona that demanded intensity at all times. Success had accelerated expectations so quickly that every appearance became a performance, even when there was nothing left to prove.
I smoked weed, I hung out with the drug dealers and the criminals, and I got...
And that made you feel better?
Interestingly enough, yes, because they have those same problems, and they found a way to get out of it. As a kid, this is what I was thinking.
And then detectives turned their attention to the equipment setup inside the studio itself. On paper, the gear looked normal for a high-level recording environment, but the placement told a different story. The primary microphone wasn't positioned for traditional performance recording. It was set up at seated height, angled toward a chair positioned directly in front of a writing desk. That layout resembled interview-style recording more than music production. Archived cassette logs found in a nearby cabinet added another layer. Several tapes were labeled with date references followed by short descriptors suggesting structured conversations rather than song sessions. Instead of track titles, labels included phrases indicating discussions, reflections, and long-form spoken content. Detectives began to suspect the studio wasn't just being used to produce music, it was being used to document ideas. Technicians analyzing the equipment configuration later concluded the environment functioned almost like a thinking lab, a controlled space designed for processing thoughts out loud, capturing ideas in real time, and refining perspectives before presenting them publicly. That type of setup suggested preparation for formats beyond traditional albums, possibly interviews, spoken word releases, or educational recordings intended for distribution outside mainstream music channels. One detective reportedly summarized the findings simply: "This didn't look like someone chasing attention. It looked like someone preparing to control it." By the time investigators finished cataloging the final materials, a consistent strategy had emerged from what initially looked like unrelated creative fragments. Ownership, independence, legacy, responsibility, transition. Those themes appeared again and again across different formats, different dates, different types of documents. And the biggest realization came quietly. None of these materials looked rushed. Nothing suggested panic. Instead, the structure suggested intention. A recognition that reinvention wasn't optional, but necessary for survival in an environment where expectations could easily become limitations.